This is a nutshell of ed philosophies, learning theories, and pedagogies. I put them on a continuum because it is inaccurate to put each in its own box with a corresponding learning theory and pedagogy. There's a lot of overlap, and I'm presenting the broadest of labels and descriptors. You can find more specific descriptors of many more of each, though they would all fall within one of these that I'll describe here. It is a nutshell, after all. And as a teacher, for good reason, you cannot strictly adhere to one philosophy or learning theory all of the time. And depending on the goal of a lesson, you will choose from a wide variety of pedagogical methods. So let's begin with some simple definitions. Ed philosophy describes what one or a society believes about teaching, learning, really getting at the purpose of education. Learning theory is a theory of how humans acquire, store, recall, and possibly apply new information and the skills. So learning theory brings a philosophy one step closer to a practice. In fact, that is what I'd call a pedagogy then, which is the enaction of an ed philosophy based on an understanding of a learning theory resulting in or reflected in the design of the curriculum content, the structure, the delivery. So let's talk about three philosophies. Perennialism. The ideals are everlasting. They're enduring truths. You study the classics, the great books, the literature to attain cultural literacy. And this isn't changing. We might add to it, but the classics never go away. The idea is that there is this stuff that everybody needs to know to be culturally literate. Essentialism is pretty similar. There's an essential knowledge to be transmitted. It's fixed, it's objective, much like perennialism. But unlike perennialism, essential knowledge can evolve and change slowly with society. In both cases, there's a focus on basics for citizenship and being a productive member or worker. And so the school teaches hard work, respect for authority, and discipline. You can see that this sounds philosophical and the purpose of ed, so you can see why philosophies and learning theories get confused and interchanged. Okay, so now move more to the right and talk about progressivism. And progressivism, we focus on the whole child, and that ideas should be tested with active experimentation. The scientific method is big in this, and that the learner is a problem solver and a problem solver of authentic experiences. So there's a strong emphasis on learning to be a democratic citizen by participating in democratic experiences. That comes from John Dewey. And he was a strong proponent of this philosophy. Again, it sounds a lot like a learning theory and a philosophy, and it is more practical than just a philosophy. And there's a strong reliance on learning by inquiry using the scientific method. I think I already said that. In fact, progressivism and constructivism as a learning theory are often used interchangeably. But the idea here is that the learner takes information in, and it isn't necessarily fixed information. There are facts, but what those mean are interpreted by the learner. So we're shifting a little bit towards less objective and more about process. Further to the right, social reconstructionism, or critical theory. Education is a means to better society through democracy. So there's a similarity there with progressivism, with highlights on making social reform and using social reform in education to then change the system to overcome oppression and improve the human conditions. And the teaching and the learning then in this is very much a process of inquiry. Okay, so now let's shift from philosophy to some corresponding learning theories. There's a whole bunch of labels on this, and you could pull up as many as 15 different labels of learning theories. And I'm going to really break them down into two categories, behaviorism and constructivism. Let's start with behaviorism. This is more traditional. Knowledge is acquired as a response to a stimulus. What one learns and does is determined by the stimulus and a reaction to it. This is B.F. Skinner. Therefore, learning is more passive, with the teacher transferring information to the learner and managing, motivating learning and behavior using extrinsic motivators of rewards and punishments. So rewards to increase a desired behavior or reward learning and of desired content, and then punishment to reduce less desired behaviors. So you can see how this aligns to perennialism and essentialism, because it's about objective reality and the teacher disseminating that information and giving it to the learner. And the learner is this fixed entity taking in this fixed bit of information, and the teacher is kind of imprinting that knowledge and skills and behavior on the student to become a productive citizen. The other main category, and again, there's a whole lot of variations, but is constructivism. And I'm going to focus on two overlapping variations, cognitive and social. They're both constructivism because they both adhere to the idea that the learner constructs their own meaning. Learners bring prior knowledge and experience to any situation, and that experience is in the context of what they bring to the situation. This is a focus on the interaction between the student and the environment, and the learner's thoughts, beliefs, experiences influence the learning process. So they begin learning with prior knowledge and provide means for the student, so that the teacher begins the learning process with uncovering that prior knowledge, and then provides a means for the student to have a voice in designing the learning and learning through authentic, real-world applications of ideas. So it focuses on cognition, metacognition, learning how to learn. And so you can see roots here then in progressivism and Reconstructionism, or critical theory. So let's get specific now about cognitivism. And it's still rooted in essentialism to some degree, along with progressivism. So it's kind of a mixture of the two. It has a similar goal of essentialism, which is to transfer knowledge. It is agreeing that there's fixed knowledge, but it means different things to different people depending on their life experiences. But it's really about how do we transmit this fixed knowledge to the learner that is aligned with a more student-centered approach, so that it is a more authentic approach that aligns more with brain-based learning and how the brain actually takes in information and filters that information. Social constructionism, similarly, does not deny the existence of facts and knowledge, but it does go further with the idea that the learner's experiences, their social setting, they filter and input what comes in from the world to produce one's own reality. And again, we're not saying that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, but what that 4 might mean to that person, what it represents, is going to be based on their experiences. So it is looking at the idea that humans create meaning and don't just acquire it. They're not a blank slate to write it upon. So this, I think, really actually fits most in line with brain-based learning. Relies upon the student having practice and activity of a concept or knowledge in a culture or in a context. And this really builds strongly on the work of Piaget and Vygotsky. Piaget with the idea of establishing equilibrium or being out of equilibrium and then getting back to equilibrium in the learning process, and Vygotsky with the idea of the zone of proximal development, that you're always pushing that edge. Now, we could go a little further with this, and I didn't put this on here because I don't think it's nearly as useful to us, but there's existentialism, which is a broader philosophy, and sometimes it's called as an ed philosophy. It's also a general philosophy. It goes further to state that reality is objective and that there is no real facts or truths except for how they're interpreted. And I can see elements of this general philosophy in progressivism and critical theory as well as constructivism. I don't think it stands alone well, at least in a useful way for our purposes as teachers in a society that has said there are essential things that we need to teach. So I don't think it's terribly useful as an ed philosophy. So that brings us to pedagogy. As we move across the spectrum, you can see, and I put these all together in one box because they're moving back and forth, and you can see the focus in the shifts from the teacher to the student, from left to right, and it's a shift from the teacher to the student doing the doing. This provides us a spectrum of teacher-centered or directed instruction to student-centered or student-directed, and on the traditional end is just that, the traditional instruction, lecture, stand and deliver, direct teaching, which aligns to this idea of disseminating information, that the teacher has information to give to the students, and also disseminating behavior norms. And so this aligns also with possibly classroom management like PBIS, and the idea that there are these fixed things and we are going to train them, and because it is more in line with the traditional, is more in line with the essentialism, in that it's fixed information, and so it tends to rely more on objective testing and teacher demonstration. Still could be a lot of hands-on, but it's still teacher-directed hands-on in what to learn and how to learn it and what it means. Moving to the right, we get to more student-centered, with instructional practices more in line with the student doing the doing. So inquiry, project-based learning, emergent curriculum, and so on, as well as classroom management that might include social contracts, restorative justice, things of that nature. So there's a focus on process, skills, active participation by the student in making the culture as practice for democracy. So you can see how, as a teacher, you might be pulling from essentialism for content, progressivism, and critical theory for process, and using a variety of methods and strategies to get to the goals, which we all share, and all those share, which is this productive, positive member of a society. So you can't put yourself in any one box of any of these three aspects of teaching and learning. The one that probably stays the most consistent is going to be the philosophy, and then that's going to determine what kind of teaching you do. But you're going to have to pull from essentialism because you have standards you have to cover, and that's the way it is. And there are going to be things, even in the most progressive of project-based classrooms that are all about student inquiry and student questions, there's still going to be direct instruction that occurs in teaching them how to do a process of gathering information, possibly how to do a library search. Not everything has to be trial and error discovery. There are things that you will train them to do. The difference is in the learning theory and the pedagogy to the right, to the student-centered, is what the teacher is teaching is not so much the facts and the information, but setting up the situations for students to discover and explore those facts and then apply them to a real-world situation.